Slavery is a very big subject. I have in my home an entire bookcase of nothing things, books about slavery in various parts of the world and various times of history. And the sad fact is that slavery has been a universal institution for thousands of years, as far back as you can trace human history. And what we're looking at is if slavery is something that happened to one race of people in one country, when in fact the spread of it was around the world.
Chattel slavery is defined as the enslaving and owning of human beings and their offspring as property, able to be bought, sold, and forced to work without wages, as distinguished from other systems of forced, unpaid, or low-wage labor also considered to be slavery. Was chattel slavery among the Africans by the Europeans unique? Which cultures enslaved the most people? Which cultures practiced slavery the longest? Which slave trade had the most slaves during their history? Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, a veteran of the United States Army and Marine Corps, former history professor, book author, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History. Many believe that European enslavement of Africans was unique and the largest slave trade in history. They use the term chattel slavery denoting the method in the United States specifically. This ignores the fact that this was not unique to the North American experience. South America also had the practice with the Spanish and Portuguese. Was it unique to the Europeans? History says no, and in fact this is a myth. Enslaving people in chains for forced labor, owning them as property, as well as their offspring, was practiced long before the European powers even first set foot in West Africa, and European Slavs were the primary targets for enslavement in Eastern and Central Europe for several thousand years by many empires. It is often believed that the word slave was derived from the Latin word for Slav as the Roman Republic and later the Empire expanded into Eastern Europe. Slavs were a primary target for their slave trade. In addition, the Slavs were themselves enslavers of others, to include Byzantine Greeks, as stated by historian Igor Froyanov. Many scholars believe that the word slave has its origins in Old Greek, leia meaning to plunder or taking booty, as well as conquer and take. There is also the Greek etymology for the word sklavos, being a derivation of sklabinos, which translates as Slavic, originally as a self-reference for the Slavic people, as Slavininu. However, Slavs had also been slaves of the ancient Macedonians and ancient Greeks, as well as the ancient Bulgars. Likewise, the Byzantine Empire that succeeded the Western Roman Empire also took Slavs as slaves, and therefore the word was used in the Greek lexicon. These slaves were in fact in generational servitude under the Byzantines, just as serfdom was also generational later throughout Europe. And these were Christians basically enslaving other Christians, but Muslims were prevented from enslaving other Muslims. But non-Muslims were fair game. The Romans took their slaves not just for agricultural labor, but also for brothels and for entertainment in the Colosseum starting in the 1st century AD. Many became gladiators, while many more were simply used as public entertainment and fed to wild animals. When the Huns arrived in Eastern Europe around 376 AD, and while not slavers as such, they did take hostages, and many of these were Slavs. Slavs, not being a unified people and just a collection of scattered peoples, were easy to conquer and enslave. The Moors from Spain and North Africa took Slavs into captivity during the 7th century and beyond. Otto the Great, in the 9th century, captured pagan Slavs and sold them into slavery. The Seljuk and Ottoman Turks used the same method against their African and European slaves. In fact, 20% of their populations were slaves. In the mid-14th century, Ottoman Sultan Murad I built an army of slaves, referred to as the Kapukulu. The Desvirme system allowed for promotion and advancement if they converted to Islam, such as within the Janissary Corps. Other slaves were kept for hard labor and basically worked to death. It is believed by many historians that Sultan Mehmed II established the first open commercial Ottoman slave market in Constantinople in the 1460s, following the model already used throughout Turkey, replacing the former Byzantine slave market. Historian Nicholas de Nicolay states that there were slaves of all ages and both sexes, often displayed naked, to be thoroughly checked, and this was true of children and young women for potential buyers. For 600 years, the Ottomans practiced the largest slave trade in history, and sometimes it was brutal. Historian Madeline C. Zilfi chronicles that under both Arab and Ottoman rule, black Africans were considered inferior to European and Caucasian slaves, and therefore less valuable, therefore expendable. Many slaves served on Ottoman ships, the oared galleys. Life was brutal and often short, as these slaves were not considered to be valuable, as they were easily replaced, unlike the black slaves from Africa who were considered quite valuable to the English, Portuguese, and Spanish colonial powers in particular. To the Muslims, they were almost worthless. But many people want to do a comparison between the Atlantic African slave trade and other forms of slavery. When it comes to sheer volume, the Arabic and Ottoman slave trades lasted 900 years longer and enslaved tens of millions more than the 13 to 14 million taken from Africa by the Europeans. More sub-Saharan Africans were sold to the Islamic world than to Europe and the Western Hemisphere combined. There were more Europeans enslaved by North Africans than there were sub-Saharan Africans enslaved and sent to the Western Hemisphere. This was slavery based upon race, so it was not created by Europeans. It was also based upon religion. Non-Muslims, as I said before, were targets. In fact, the Europeans were very late to the party and basically amateurs when it came to slavery. The Spanish and Portuguese were the most effective, taking over 90% of the Africans for their colonial empires starting in the mid-15th century. The English actively entered the slave trade over 100 years later. Millions of Muslim slaves were Slavic Christians, among many other Christian ethnic groups. However, what is of interest was that if Christians or other non-Muslim groups paid tribute, basically paying taxes or bribes, then this often prevented the taking of slaves in most cases. It was a protection racket. This was also true of the Ottomans for the most part, but not necessarily for the Arab cultures who still exacted tribute, but often still raided for slaves all over Europe and East and Central Africa, such as the East African and Barbary slave trades. Slavery for life was not unusual, and the children of slaves inherited that status in many cases. Punishments in their society ranged from impaling, flogging, burning, hanging, and beheading. All were normal punishments in Muslim culture, but for a slave to escape and to be recaptured or simply charged with a crime, these punishments, execution by any means, were standard procedures. This was mainly due to the vast numbers of potential slaves that cost nothing to acquire and were worked to death in various ways. Ottoman and Arab slavers took their slaves from territories they either raided or had conquered, requiring no expense for obtaining free labor. A century after the Western societies ended legal slavery, the Young Turks adopted an anti-slavery stance in the early 20th century. As stated by historians Clarence Smith and William Gervais, Sultan Abdul Hamid II's personal slaves were freed in 1909, but members of his dynasty were allowed to keep their slaves, and, finally, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk ended legal slavery in the Turkish Republic. However, Turkey waited until 1933 to ratify the 1926 League of Nations Convention on the Suppression of Slavery. Nonetheless, illegal sales of girls were reportedly continued at least into the early 1930s, and the legislation explicitly prohibiting slavery was not adopted until 1964. In other Muslim countries, slavery also lasted longer than in the West, with Saudi Arabia finally ending legal slavery in 1962. Legal slavery lasted in the Islamic world from the 6th century well into the 20th century. Muslim slavers operated from Europe, Africa, and Asia to the Indian Ocean, which involved hundreds of millions of people being slaves. Yes, Muslim slave trading was the greatest in history, and it still exists today, only it is not openly practiced nor endorsed by any government. There has been an ongoing debate as to whether the Irish were the first slaves in the Americas, predating the first black African slaves by almost a decade. Slavery is perhaps one of the oldest profit-making endeavors in human history, and the Irish were a special target for 1,000 years. Throughout history, the Irish were persecuted by one faction or another, to include enslavement and indentured servitude. When did the Irish first become slaves? How long did the selling of the Irish continue? Who was responsible? Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former soldier, Marine Corps scout sniper, history professor, historian and book author, and we will answer these questions and other issues on this segment of Forgotten History. Some groups deny the Irish slavery under English and later British rule, claiming that this was nothing more than voluntary indentured servitude, which did exist. However, there are counter-arguments that will be challenged here. There is a legitimate dispute as to the numbers enslaved, especially during the 17th century before the Act of Union in 1707. The official British legal terminology used was indentured servants. Whether the servants in question had willingly signed the indenture contract to emigrate to the Americas or were forced to go. Many were forced. Therefore, those transported unwillingly and effectively sold were not considered to be indentured. This included political prisoners, vagrants, convicts, political activists, thieves, prostitutes, or people who had been defined as undesirable by the English government. The Irish introduction to slavery was during the first Viking raids in the year 795, lasting through the mid-9th century. This period saw the Irish killed and enslaved. Just like many other societies, the Vikings attacked. Most of these early raids were along the northern and eastern coast using hit-and-run tactics. The Vikings would then flee with treasure and slaves and return to either their holdings in Scotland or back to Norway. Usually, many slaves who were of value were ransomed back to their families, but others remained in captivity. Then, from the year 837 onward, larger targets such as the greater monastic towns of Armagh, Glendalough, Kildare, Slane, Clonard, and Clonmacnoise, and Lismore were hit by larger forces. These large-scale raids generally spared the smaller local churches and villages far inland, but slaves were still taken, mostly to Scotland and Iceland. In 875, Irish slaves in Iceland launched Europe's largest slave rebellion since the end of the Roman Empire, when Hrólfr Hólmarsson's slaves killed him and fled to Vestmannaeyjar. In 841, the port that became known as Dublin was taken and occupied by both Olaf and Ivar the Boneless, and by 853, this part of Ireland was a Norse trading center, and slaves were a large part of it. The slave trade did not stop with Ivar's death in 873. Finally, in 902, driven out of Dublin by the combined forces of Brege and Leinster, but the Vikings came back in 914 and reclaimed all the territory, taking more slaves. But Irish resistance was not over. In 980, the Irish, under Mael Sechnal Mac Domhnall, king of Meath, fought and managed to defeat the Vikings and freed all of their slaves. Some Vikings who remained assimilated and adapted to Christianity and became part of Irish society. The final nail in the coffin regarding Vikings holding land and taking slaves was in 1014 at the Battle of Clontarf, when Brian Boru, High King of Ireland, attacked Dublin, aided by his allies, the Limerick Vikings. They fought other Irish allied to the local Vikings in Dublin, and Boru's force won, and all the slaves were again freed, thus ending the legacy of constant Norse raids, whether from Danes or Norwegians. The period forced enslavement and severity ended a century after the Norman invasion of England in October 1066. Subsequent Norman rulers of England eyed Ireland, and slavery in its true form was abolished in 1102. In 1155, Pope Adrian IV supposedly gave Henry II of England a papal bull, granting the king the authority to invade Ireland. However, many historians believe that this authorization was a forgery. Regardless, Henry II of England faced excommunication for the murder of Thomas à Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, so it is possible. However, Adrian's successor, Pope Alexander III, granted the lands of Ireland to Henry II, although it was not his land to give. The Norman conquest of England and Ireland were cataclysmic events that would shape Ireland's as well as world history, and create tensions with England for the next 800 years. The Normans were initially invited to Ireland by Dermot MacMurrough, the deposed King of Leinster. He is sometimes referred to as Dermot of the Foreigners, and his grandmother was the granddaughter of Brian Boru. In October 1171, King Henry II landed in Ireland and allowed Dermot to recruit soldiers and mercenaries, as Ireland was made up of several kingdoms at war with each other. The city of Dublin and the surrounding area were under Norman occupation and would be called the Pale, or the safe zone. Going beyond that was considered foolish, hence the term we use today, going beyond the pale. But the Normans ended the practice of slavery in Ireland, but not serfdom, for at least a few hundred years. Despite the Norman abolishment of slavery, serfdom was still alive and well. Serfs were, unlike slaves, bound to the land, and the land meant everything. So selling people into slavery would have left no one to farm and conduct agriculture. Following the Battle of Kinsale, in 1601, when the Irish and Spanish alliance was defeated, the Irish aristocracy fled to Europe, but the commoners remained, and they left a power vacuum filled by English nobles. Reports vary, and the numbers are in dispute, but the high number is that English forces had 30,000 captured Irish and Spanish soldiers. Other sources say half that number, around 15,000, were engaged, with 7,000 to 8,000 being captured. The Spanish allies were allowed to leave, but not the Irish. In 1603 or 1604, King James I of England, crowned on March 23, 1603, reportedly issued the order of banishment. This allowed those Irish captured to be sold, a permanent banishment. After nearly a decade, the king gave permission for the English Governor-General to collect and sell the captured Irish soldiers as slaves and send them to the New World in the Americas. In 1612, the first recorded Irish slaves were sold, possibly to the Portuguese, and taken to the Amazon River Basin, in their colony in modern-day Brazil. This brought them to the New World. There has been some dispute as to whether these people were indentured servants or slaves, but it is clear that they were forced out of Ireland to the New World, so it seems illogical and ridiculous to assume that they went voluntarily, hence the status of slaves. It has been chronicled that in 1625, James I's son, Charles I, issued the decree, and it may be possible before his death in March 1625, but given the timeline on James's death, it would appear that his son, Charles, probably did issue the royal decree authorizing the Irish slaves. This included prisoners captured, those deemed to be common criminals, and rabble-rousers who were sold. They were to become the property of the English plantation owners in the North American colonies. As a result, tens of thousands of Irish men and women were sent to the Eastern American colonies, as well as Guyana, Antigua, and Montserrat. As well, between 1629 and 1632, as other Caribbean locations over the next few decades were infiltrated, but the exact number may never be known. By 1637, approximately 69% of the population of Montserrat were Irish. Many were indentured servants, yet some were slaves. The rationale was simple. Black slaves had to be purchased at a cost of around 20 to 50 pounds sterling, a huge sum of money in those days. However, Irish slaves were sold for 900 pounds of cotton per person, but also traded for tobacco and indigo in a straight barter system. It would appear that the Irish then became the largest source of slaves for English slave traders and plantation owners at that time, far surpassing the African slave trade until the early to mid-1700s. Between 1641, during the Irish Rebellion, to 1652, it has been stated that over 550,000 Irish were killed by English forces, and 300,000 more were sold as slaves, mostly military-aged men. Their children, especially women and girls, were sold and considered quite valuable in the domestic service roles. The greatest perpetrator of this was Oliver Cromwell, who defeated Charles I in 1649 during the English Civil War and had him executed. Cromwell, as Lord Protector, waged a ruthless war against the Irish, starting in 1649. By 1650, it is claimed that nearly 29,000 Irish were sold to planters in St. Kitts. During the decade of the 1650s, it is also claimed, as well as disputed, that around 100,000 Irish children, generally from 10 to 14 years of age, were taken from their parents and were also sold, and sold themselves also as slaves or indentured servants in the West Indies, Virginia, the Carolinas, and New England. It is also claimed that between 1651 and 1660, the Irish slaves far outnumbered the colonists in all areas. In 1652, Cromwell ordered that 12,000 Irish were to be sold to Barbados, and those numbers are not in dispute, only their status. On 1 May 1654, his "To Hell or to Connaught" proclamation was issued during the Act of Settlement of 1662. This was when the English began confiscating all Irish-held lands, and the native Irish were relocated west of the Shannon River. Those who resisted were sent to the West Indies as slaves or executed. His own words proclaimed, quote, "Those who fail to transplant themselves into Connaught or County Clare within 6 months shall be attainted of high treason, or to be sent to America or other parts beyond the seas. Those banished who return ought to suffer the pains of death as felons by virtue of this act without benefit of clergy." End quote. The English could kill the Irish without penalty, but selling them offered great profit. It is claimed that over 80,000 more Irish were sold, with 52,000 going to the colonies of Barbados and Virginia, but again we cannot verify the exact numbers. Many argue that these were indentured servants, not slaves, yet there are no records of contracts between those forcibly removed and their benefactors. One may assume that, given the barter system of using tobacco and cotton as a trade item for workers, that these deported Irish were, in fact, slaves. In 1656, the Council of State ordered the roundup of 1,000 Irish girls and 1,000 Irish boys in their early teens, even some children, to be rounded up and sold to Jamaican planters. These numbers are in dispute, but do seem reasonable, as these would be children whose parents were already deported. Part of this order was an edict passed on October 2, 1665, which stated, quote, "Upon report of Committee for America concerning proposals for transporting persons from Long Island to Jamaica, to confer with the Committee for Jamaica." End quote. The persons were Irish, and no indentured servant would be released to go to Jamaica. These had to be forcibly exported Irish, who were already present in New York. In fact, some of the English receiving these Irish slaves seemed rather concerned, hence this following report, quote, "Commission appointing Cornelius Holland, Colonel Owen Rowe, Sir Thomas Roth, and 14 others accompany, by the name of the Governor and Company of the City of London, for the plantation of the Somers Islands, to take into consideration the present condition of those plantations, many well-affected persons there having been much oppressed and unjustly dealt with in relation to matters of conscience." End quote. Whitehall, 1653, June 28th. This situation, with the forcibly removed Irish not being a people to take subjugation lightly, appeared to have created the fear of an uprising, and this seems to be explained in the Whitehall document from November 18, 1656. Quote, "The Council of State to Captain Wilkinson. Importance of the Somers Islands to the interest of the Commonwealth. Supposition that the Spaniards will endeavor to get a footing there. Doubtful that a principle of disaffection may yet be retained by some of the inhabitants. He is encouraged to attend to his duties as commander of the fort, to keep a vigilant eye upon the malignant and discontented party, that they may have the less opportunity to prejudice the island's safety, and to use his best endeavors to secure the interest of the Commonwealth." End quote. This referred to the Irish population that must have been slaves, and they feared an uprising. No reason to worry about indentured servants. So, whether one accepts the reality of Irish slavery or not, the fact remains that there were Irish people forced into slavery. However, the exact numbers may never be known.
And so if you're going to have reparations for slavery, it's going to be the greatest transfer of wealth back and forth, and between and cross-hauling, as they say in the railroads, because the number of whites, for example, who were enslaved in North Africa by the Barbary pirates exceeded the number of Africans enslaved in the United States and in the American colonies before that, put together. But nobody is going to North Africa to ask for reparations because nobody is going to be fool enough to give it to them. Here we have intellectuals who can imagine a different history from the rest of the world, even though it's so similar to the rest of the world.
Slavery is as old as human civilization, dating back beyond recorded history, and it exists even still today. Every culture on every continent practiced some form of slavery, whether it was serfdom, indentured servitude or collective peasantry. However, when the slave trade is mentioned, people normally think of the black African slave trade to the Western Hemisphere during the colonial period from 1500 to the mid-1800s, as practiced by the European colonial powers. Estimates range from 10 to 13 million Africans being brought to the New World, with around 10 million surviving to be sold in North and South America, as well as in the Caribbean islands. Of this number, the best estimate is that 450,000 went to the British, French, and Spanish colonies in what is now the United States and Caribbean. Brazil alone received almost 5 million, the rest going to the Spanish colonies in South America. Slavery still exists in the world, yet most of the major powers ignore the fact and refuse to even acknowledge that it still exists. It is still quite active. Yet, 6 decades before the American Civil War, a war was fought by the United States on foreign shores to try and stop the white slave trade. What was the white slave trade? Does it still exist? Who were the Barbary pirates? What was the result of American intervention? How did it occur, and what was the aftermath? And how did 9 U.S. Marines and their mercenaries make history and give birth to a legendary fighting force while also ending the white slave trade in North Africa?
Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former soldier, Marine Corps scout sniper, history professor, historian and book author, and we will answer these questions and other issues on this segment of Forgotten History.
During the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the world was on fire, as France and Britain were engaged in the Napoleonic Wars, which was another series of conflicts just like the 7 Years' War, again involving every nation in Europe. The 7 Years' War was also known as the French and Indian War in the United States. Both these conflicts were fought on every continent and on every ocean and in every colony. Even during these protracted wars, the transatlantic slave trade continued. It was big business. While the European powers were destroying each other, Thomas Jefferson became the 3rd President of the United States from March 4, 1801 to March 4, 1809, and he had several major issues to contend with. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 from France doubled the size of the United States. The Yazoo territorial disputes in western Georgia were hotly contested. The launching of the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1804 to explore the newly acquired country, and the contested issue of slavery. In 1806, Jefferson denounced the international slave trade as a violation of human rights and called upon Congress to criminalize it. Congress responded by approving the act prohibiting importation of slaves the following year. No longer could slaves be brought from Africa, although slavery was still legal in the United States. Then there were also the rising tensions between the United States and Great Britain, which dominated the final years of Jefferson's second term, as the Royal Navy had been seizing American merchant ships and impressing sailors. However, one situation which has gone largely unnoticed in history was Jefferson being the first president to send the military overseas into direct action: the war against the Barbary pirates. For decades prior to Jefferson's accession to office, the Barbary Coast pirates of North Africa had been capturing foreign merchant and warships, stealing their valuable cargoes, and enslaving crew members, while often demanding huge ransoms for their release. Many of these ships and crews were American. Before independence, American merchant ships were protected from the Barbary pirates by the naval and diplomatic influence of Great Britain, which had threatened the use of military force should their ships be molested. However, that American protection came to an end after the colonies won their independence. The Barbary pirates also attacked the coastal northern Mediterranean, launching attacks against France, Italy, and Sicily, kidnapping women as white slaves, primarily and whenever possible, notable wealthy persons and ships for ransom. In their feverish search for white women slaves, a few pirates even went as far as the coast of Iceland, raiding inland to kidnap women and bring them back to North Africa. North African slave markets thrived, as, under Islamic law, known as Sharia, although fellow Muslims could not be enslaved, non-Muslims could be and were. Over a period of more than 300 years, it is estimated that 1 million white Europeans, to include those captured at sea as well as through land raids abroad, were enslaved. Many of these were Americans captured at sea. In 1794, in reaction to the attacks, Congress had passed a law authorizing the payment of tribute to the Barbary States. Part of that law was the Naval Act of 1794, which authorized the construction of 6 frigates, establishing the United States Navy. By the end of the 1700s, when Jefferson was Secretary of State, the United States had concluded treaties with all of the Barbary states, the Ottoman regencies of Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, along with independent Morocco. When Congress authorized $80,000 for Morocco to not molest American shipping, it was considered a good deal, as it was a cost savings when compared to the loss of ships, cargo, and sailors. The Bey of Algiers, Mustafa Baba, also agreed, and many American merchantmen were escorted by Portuguese warships, as Portugal also had a treaty with the Islamic states. But Jefferson was opposed to paying tribute, which he considered to be a modern Danegeld. When Saxon England paid the Danish Vikings not to attack, it did not work. Although Morocco and Algiers initially agreed, just weeks before Jefferson took office, Tripoli began attacking American merchant ships in an attempt to extract further tribute. Jefferson had seen enough. Jefferson tried diplomacy, and his letter to Pasha Yusuf Karamanli emphasized, "Our sincere desire to cultivate peace and commerce with your subjects." Pasha Karamanli, the ruler of modern-day Tunisia, felt that the Americans had insulted him by not offering to pay tribute. He threatened continued actions if not so respected. Pasha Karamanli was already at war with Sweden, having broken an existing treaty, after Sweden agreed to pay annual tribute and ransom for 131 captives. 14 Swedish merchantmen had been seized by Tripolitan corsairs. Some of these were white women who were being transported on Swedish merchantmen, and it is not known if they were ever recovered, as the white women were rarely ransomed. They were highly prized and sold. The Pasha then declared war on the United States on May 14, 1801 by chopping down the flagpole at the American consulate in Tripoli, a direct act of war. Jefferson sent 3 frigates and a schooner under the command of U.S. Navy Commodore Richard Dale as a show of force and to protect U.S. ships entering the Mediterranean through the Straits of Gibraltar. Dale learned of the declaration when he reached Gibraltar on July 1, 1801. From that point, Dale's ships blocked 2 of the Pasha's corsairs operating as raiders and messengers inside the harbor. Yusuf Karamanli was shocked at the American audacity. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, Selim III in Istanbul, was also less than amused, yet did not interfere when the Americans became involved. He had just concluded treaties with Russia and Austria and was trying to westernize his empire along Western lines. This included eliminating the white slave trade, and this position was not favored by many of his subordinate regional leaders, especially in North Africa, and they launched a revolt against him, and his cousin and successor, Mustafa IV, had him murdered in 1807. He was not about to give up such a lucrative business. The U.S. blockades halted Barbary trade and raids with Europe, but did not stop Tripoli's trade with the other Barbary states. It did, however, incite the other rulers, who considered siding with the Pasha, and they expelled their American diplomats. The United States was putting a major dent into their pirate enterprises, to include the white slave trade. The possibility of Tunis, Algiers, and Morocco joining forces as a result of losing this lucrative business became a serious concern during 1802, but in 1803, Captain Edward Preble was the new American naval commander, and he was aware of the white slave trade and piracy, and he began to deal with it. On September 12, 1803, the USS Constitution arrived off the Barbary coast to confront the Tripolitan pirates. In October 1803, the frigate USS Philadelphia ran aground and was attacked and seized, and the 307-man crew was held for ransom. In response, on February 16, 1804, a group under Navy Lieutenant Stephen Decatur slipped into Tripoli harbor after dark, boarded and set fires that destroyed the Philadelphia. The Pasha, in response, demanded an outrageous sum in ransom for his American hostages, even threatening death if it was not paid. In 1804, Commodore Samuel Barron, aboard the USS President, took command of 11 vessels, and he had new orders. But due to illness, he handed command of the squadron to Captain John Rogers. Jefferson had again seen enough and decided to take direct and immediate action. He sent the order. Ex-Consul William Heaton, a former Army captain who used the title of general, and United States Marine Corps First Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon would lead a force of 8 U.S. Marines and 500 mercenaries to take Derna and free any hostages. These mercenaries were Greeks from Crete, Arabs, and Berbers, opposed to the regime, and started on a march across the desert from Alexandria, Egypt in April 1805. Their objective was to capture the Tripolitan city of Derna. The Muslim troops were under the command of Egyptian Sheikh el-Tahib, the Ottoman Empire viceroy. William Heaton, who was overbearing and not very friendly, kept himself aloof from his men and was in overall command but leading only half the group. He had a tough job controlling the largely undisciplined mercenaries, and the infighting between the Christian Greeks and Muslims, few of whom were professional soldiers, became a problem. His promises of money and loot once they took Derna was looked upon skeptically. However, O'Bannon and his 8 Marines embedded with their mercenaries shared food, hardship, water, and earned their trust. O'Bannon decided to take the Muslims from Heaton, exchanging them for his Greeks. The Marines built a strong fellowship by not denigrating the Islamic faith. They discussed their similarities and differences. O'Bannon also knew that many of these men had either been hostages themselves or had lost friends and family to the white slave trade. Heaton reported in May 1805, quote, "Our only provisions are a handful of rice and 2 biscuits a day," end quote. From March 22nd to March 30th, several Arab mercenaries, under the command of Sheikh Hamid el-Tahib, staged mutinies. By April 8, when he crossed the border into Libya and Tripoli, Heaton had quelled the Arab mutinies, but he could not stop the desertions. In late April, his army finally reached the port city of Bomba, some miles up the coast from Derna, where U.S. Navy warships USS Argus, Nautilus, and Hornet, with Commodore James Barron and Captain Isaac Hull, were waiting for him. Heaton received fresh supplies and the money to pay his mercenaries. Argus gave an additional cannon to the troops. On April 26th, Captain Hull's ships then opened fire and bombarded Derna's batteries for an hour. Meanwhile, Heaton divided his remaining army into 2 separate attacking parties. The attack began at 1445 hours, with Lieutenant O'Bannon and his Marines leading the attack with 50 inexperienced Greek gunners. Heaton's force was halted due to high volumes of enemy musket fire, but O'Bannon pushed his men through the inaccurate fire, as witnessed from the ships. Carefully interchanging his men into various ranks to fire, advance, reload, and continue the process, O'Bannon's force took the fort cannons. Heaton, wounded in the left wrist, would report later that O'Bannon, with his Marines and Greeks, had, quote, passed through a shower of musketry from the walls of houses, took possession of the battery, end quote. Heaton's forces caught up and turned the defenders' own abandoned guns against them, pushing them out of the city and into a well-placed ambush set up by O'Bannon just outside the main gate. During the entire battle, O'Bannon lost 2 men killed and 3 wounded Marines, with 9 of his mercenaries killed. Heaton's losses among the Muslims is unknown. O'Bannon raised the flag over the captured city at 1600 hours. They had just defeated a force 4 times their number, who were in a fortified defensive posture. And for the first time in American history, that a flag from the United States had been raised on foreign soil. Hostages were freed, and the Navy sank the pirate ships in harbor. Accurate naval fire from Argus and the other ships forced them back, and Derna remained in American hands. Yusuf reluctantly signed a peace treaty on June 10, 1805, aboard the USS Constitution. The treaty granted American ships passage through the Mediterranean without further payments of tribute and freedom from harassment. This also meant joining the other European nations in halting the very active and overt white slave trade. The war was over, and so was active white slavery from North Africa. Marine Corps legend has it that Hamid presented O'Bannon with a Mameluke sword, a sign of prestige and power. Emboldened by this event, more European nations also increased their naval presence and resisted the Barbary pirates, stopped paying tribute, crippling their commercial trade and extortion rackets, ending their raids on southern coastal Europe, ending hostage-taking, and their demand for ransoms and the white slave trade. Presley O'Bannon and his 8 Marines had done the seemingly impossible, but it would not be the last time Marines were called upon to do the impossible and succeed. Simplify.
We have our own myth makers in the African American historical establishment. All the Egyptians look like Michael Jordan. All our people were black gods and kings. You know, we were not complicitous in the slave trade. There wouldn't be a slave trade Africans sold other Africans to white people. That was the slave trade. That's the first thing we honestly have to admit. Remember the story of Livingston, Dr. Livingston? Sure. The reason that was so important is that almost no white men had penetrated the interior of Africa. What was there? No roads, snakes, mosquitoes, death, malaria, right? The white people were along the coast. It was black kingdoms like Queen Njinga's kingdom in Angola. What's now Angola? Ghana, Dahomey. They grew rich from the slave trade, selling other Africans. They would go and wage wars just to sell other black people to white people. This is something we've been so ashamed about, we pretend that it's not true. It is the nasty, dirty secret of African American history. We are just as corrupt and despicable as any other people. And if we have the right to oppress, we will oppress just like the white man oppressed us. That is human nature. Unfortunately, that's just the way it is. And the only way to overcome that is to be honest about it. Is to be honest about it, admit the truth, and then all try to do better. As my main man, guy I admire so much, Cornel West, says, we're all recovering racists. We're all recovering racists.
Thank you for watching this episode of Forgotten History. If you liked what you saw, please click like, share, and subscribe. And if you would like to assist with the ever-increasing cost of production, please consider becoming a channel member and joining our Patreon page. Please check out our merchandise store. And thanks for watching.